The prison bus rolled through the gates just after 9 in the morning. Inside, handcuffed to his seat, sat a man who looked like he'd be more comfortable behind a desk than behind bars. His name was David Richardson. He was 38 years old, wore wire-rimmed glasses, and had the kind of soft hands that came from years of pushing papers instead of pushing weights. The other men on the bus were different. Tattoos covered their arms. Their eyes were hard. They'd been through this before. David was clearly a first-timer, and in prison, first-timers stuck out like a sore thumb. As the bus came to a stop, David looked out the window at Oakwood Correctional Facility. The place was massive. Gray concrete walls stretched up toward the sky. Guard towers stood at each corner. Razor wire gleamed in the morning sun. This was going to be his home for the next 3 years. White-collar fraud, that's what they'd gotten him for. Numbers on spreadsheets that didn't add up. Money that went places it shouldn't have gone. The guards processed them one by one. Strip search, delousing shower. Orange jumpsuit, bedroll, basic toiletries. The whole thing felt mechanical, like being processed through a factory. David kept his mouth shut and did what he was told. He'd learned that much from his lawyer. Don't cause trouble. Keep your head down. Do your time. What nobody knew, what wasn't in any of his files or records, was what David had done before he became an accountant. Before the office job and the mortgage and the white picket fence, he'd spent 8 years in the military. Not behind a desk either. He'd been a combat instructor, teaching hand-to-hand fighting to young soldiers who were heading overseas. After that, he'd spent another 5 years training in Brazilian jiu-jitsu at a gym in his hometown. He had a black belt gathering dust in a box somewhere in his ex-wife's attic. But David had made a choice when he knew prison was coming. He'd kept all of that off his paperwork. He'd made sure his military record stayed separate from his criminal case. In prison, standing out was dangerous. Being known as someone who could fight made you a target. Someone would always want to test you, to prove they were tougher, meaner, stronger. David didn't want any of that. He just wanted to survive his sentence and get back to his daughter. By the 3rd day, David had been assigned to cell block D. The place had a rhythm to it, like any community. There were rules, both the official ones and the ones that really mattered. The official rules were simple. Don't fight, don't steal, follow the schedule. The real rules were more complicated. Cell block D belonged to a man named Tommy Rodriguez. Everyone called him Bull, and the name fit. He was 6'3", built like a refrigerator, and had arms covered in faded prison ink. Bull had been inside for 12 years on an armed robbery charge. He ran things quietly, efficiently. If you wanted protection, you went through Bull. If you wanted to buy or sell anything, you went through Bull. If you had a problem with someone, Bull decided how it got handled. David watched all of this from a distance. He could see the structure, the hierarchy, the way power flowed through the cell block like water finding its level. He recognized it from his military days. Every unit had guys like Bull, unofficial leaders who made things work when the official channels failed. His cellmate was an older guy named Pete, doing his 4th year for drug possession. Pete was all right, quiet, kept to himself. He gave David the rundown on the first night. "You seem like a smart guy," Pete said, lying on his bunk and staring at the ceiling. "So I'll tell you straight. Don't make eye contact with Bull's crew. Don't take anything that's not yours. Don't get involved in other people's business. If someone tests you, and they will test you, you got 2 choices. Back down and become somebody's punk, or stand up and probably get your face rearranged. Either way, it's not great." David nodded, taking it all in. "How long before they test me?" Pete laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You got maybe a week. Maybe less. You look soft, man. No offense, but that's just the truth. Guys in here, they smell weakness like sharks smell blood." The days fell into a pattern. Wake up at 6. Breakfast in the cafeteria. Work detail in the laundry. Lunch, yard time, dinner. Lockdown at 8. The routine was mind-numbing, but David was grateful for it. Routine meant predictability. Predictability meant survival. He started noticing things going missing from his cell. Small stuff at first. A bar of soap. Some instant coffee he'd bought from the commissary. His toothpaste. Pete saw it happening but didn't say anything. This was part of the test, David realized. They were seeing if he'd react, if he'd complain, if he'd go crying to the guards. David said nothing. He bought more soap, more coffee. He acted like he didn't even notice. In the yard, he kept to himself. He'd walk the perimeter, getting exercise without drawing attention. Some guys lifted weights. Some played basketball. Some just stood in groups talking in low voices about things David didn't want to know about. He watched Bull sometimes from a distance. The man had a presence. When he walked through the yard, people moved out of his way without even thinking about it. Bull had a lieutenant, a guy named Rick Patterson. Rick was younger, maybe 30, with a shaved head and a scar that ran from his ear to his jaw. Where Bull was calm and calculating, Rick was aggressive, always looking for a reason to start something. He was the enforcer, the guy who did Bull's dirty work. On David's 6th day, Rick started watching him. David could feel the eyes on him during yard time. He didn't react, didn't look back, just kept walking his laps, staying in his own world. On day 7, Rick spoke to him for the first time. David was sitting alone at a table during lunch, eating the mystery meat they called Salisbury steak. Rick walked over and sat down across from him uninvited. "You're the new guy," Rick said. It wasn't a question. David looked up, met his eyes for just a second, then went back to his food. "Yeah, you know who I am?" "Yeah," Rick leaned forward. "Then you know how things work around here." David set down his fork. He kept his voice calm, neutral. "I'm just trying to do my time, man. I'm not looking for trouble." Rick smiled, but it wasn't friendly. "Nobody looks for trouble in here. Trouble finds you anyway." He stood up and walked away. David's hands were steady as he picked up his fork again, but his heart was pounding. He knew what was coming. The real test was about to begin, and when it did, he'd have to make a choice that would define the rest of his sentence. Pete was right. They'd smelled weakness. Now they were coming to see if he'd bleed. The harassment started small, just like Pete had warned him it would. David's commissary items kept disappearing. His spare socks vanished from his laundry bag. Someone poured water on his bunk while he was at breakfast, soaking his thin mattress. Each time he said nothing. He just dealt with it and moved on. In the yard, Rick and his friends started getting closer. They'd walk past David and bump into him. Not hard enough to be an obvious attack, but enough to send a message. David would step aside, say nothing, and keep moving. He knew what they wanted. They wanted him to snap, to push back, to give them a reason. By the end of his 2nd week, the whole cell block was watching. This was entertainment for guys who had nothing but time. Everyone wanted to see what the quiet accountant would do when things finally got serious. Would he fight? Would he cry? Would he run to the guards for protection? Pete tried to give him advice one night after lockdown. "Listen, man," he said from the top bunk. "I've seen this play out 100 times. You got no good options here. If you fight Rick, you'll lose. Guy's been in and out of jail since he was 16. He knows how to hurt people. But if you don't fight, you'll spend the next 3 years as somebody's target." David stared at the ceiling, his hands behind his head. "Maybe there's a third option." "There's not," Pete said. "Trust me." There's not, but David wasn't so sure. In the military, they'd taught him that violence was always a last resort, not a first response. The best fighters, his instructors used to say, were the ones who never had to fight at all. They carried themselves in a way that made people think twice. They controlled situations before situations controlled them. The real test came on Friday during lunch. David was in line at the cafeteria, tray in hand, waiting for the servers to slop food onto his plate. The room was packed, loud with conversation and the clatter of trays. Rick appeared beside him, seemingly out of nowhere. "You know what I noticed about you?" Rick said, loud enough for the people around them to hear. "You think you're better than everybody else. Walking around here with your head up like you're too good for this place." David didn't respond. He took his tray and started walking toward an empty table. Rick followed him. "Hey, I'm talking to you." David set his tray down and turned to face Rick. He kept his voice calm and quiet. "I'm not better than anybody. I'm just trying to eat my lunch. You ignoring me?" Rick's voice got louder. More people were watching now. This was it. The moment everyone had been waiting for. David picked up his fork and started eating. He didn't look at Rick, didn't acknowledge him. Every instinct from his training told him that engaging would only make things worse. That's when Rick made his move. He reached over and knocked David's tray off the table. Food splattered across the floor. The cafeteria went dead silent. Even the guards stopped moving, watching to see what would happen next. David looked at his spilled lunch, then slowly stood up. He was at least 5 inches shorter than Rick and probably 60 pounds lighter. To everyone watching, this looked like a mismatch. The accountant versus the enforcer. Everyone knew how this was going to end. "Pick it up," Rick said, pointing at the mess on the floor. David bent down and started picking up his tray. The room stayed quiet. Some guys were shaking their heads. The new guy was backing down. He was going to be prey for the rest of his sentence. But as David stood back up, tray in hand, Rick shoved him. Hard. David stumbled backward, catching himself against the table. The tray clattered to the floor again. "I said pick it up," Rick repeated, smiling now. He was enjoying this. David took a deep breath. He could feel his training kicking in, muscle memory from thousands of hours on the mat. But he pushed it down. Not yet. There had to be another way. "We don't need to do this," David said quietly, looking Rick directly in the eyes. "I'm not your enemy, man. I'm just trying to do my time," Rick laughed. "You hear this guy?" He looked around at the crowd that had formed. "He thinks he can just talk his way out of this." Then Rick shoved him again, harder this time. David's back hit the wall. The circle of inmates tightened around them. This was the moment. Fight or flight. Stand up or get crushed. What happened next took maybe 3 seconds, but to everyone watching it felt like slow motion. Rick reached out to grab David by the collar, probably planning to throw him to the ground or slam him against the wall again. But the moment Rick's hand got close, David moved. Not with aggression, not with anger, just with pure technical precision. He caught Rick's wrist with his left hand, stepped to the side, and used Rick's own forward momentum against him. It was a basic Aikido redirect, the kind of thing David had taught to 18-year-old recruits on their first day of training. Rick went stumbling past him off balance, crashing into a table. David immediately stepped back, hands visible at his sides, palms open. He wasn't aggressive, wasn't threatening. He'd simply moved out of the way and let Rick's own force work against him. The crowd murmured. This wasn't what they expected. Rick spun around, his face red with rage and embarrassment. He'd been made to look like a fool in front of everyone. That was worse than losing a fight. He charged at David like a bull, all rage and no technique. This time, David didn't have a choice. Rick was coming at him with serious intent to harm, and the guards were still too far away to stop it. David's training took over completely. He sidestepped Rick's charge, hooked his leg, and guided him down to the floor using a basic jiu-jitsu takedown. Rick hit the concrete with a thud that echoed through the cafeteria. Before the bigger man could get up, David had already stepped back again, hands up, showing he wasn't continuing the fight. Rick lay on the ground, the wind knocked out of him, staring up at the ceiling in shock. The whole thing had taken maybe 4 seconds. 4 seconds that would change everything. Whistles blew. Guards came rushing in from all sides, shouting orders. "On the ground. Both of you. Hands behind your heads." David complied immediately, dropping to his knees and putting his hands behind his head. Rick was slower to respond, still trying to catch his breath. As the guards hauled them both up and started walking them toward segregation, David caught a glimpse of Bull Rodriguez standing by the wall. The big man was watching with an expression David couldn't quite read. It wasn't anger. It wasn't respect either. It was more like calculation, like Bull was reassessing everything. He thought he knew about the quiet accountant. The last thing David heard, before the cafeteria doors closed behind him, was Pete's voice cutting through the noise. "I'll be damned," Pete said to no one in particular. "Did you guys see that?" They had all seen it. And nothing in Cell Block D would ever be quite the same again. Segregation was exactly what it sounded like. A cell by yourself, 23 hours a day locked in a space barely big enough to turn around in. 1 hour for exercise in a cage that wasn't much bigger. No contact with other inmates. No phone calls. No commissary. Just you, 4 concrete walls, and a whole lot of time to think. David sat on his bunk and waited. He knew the routine. They'd review the security footage, interview witnesses, and decide who started what. In a regular prison fight, both guys usually got punished equally. It didn't matter who threw the first punch. But this case was different, and David knew it. He'd been careful. Very careful. He'd never initiated contact. Never thrown a punch. Every move he'd made had been defensive, redirecting Rick's aggression rather than meeting it with his own. The cameras would show that clearly. On the 3rd day, a guard came to his cell. "Richardson, let's go. Warden wants to see you." The warden's office was a different world from the cell blocks. There was carpet on the floor. Actual furniture? A window with a view of the parking lot beyond the prison walls. The warden was a thin man in his 50s with gray hair and tired eyes. He'd probably seen 1,000 fights during his career. This was just another one to deal with. Sit down, the warden said, gesturing to a chair across from his desk. David sat. The warden opened a file folder and glanced at the papers inside. Says here you're in for fraud. White-collar stuff. First offense. You've been here 2 weeks. He looked up at David. So you want to tell me how a guy like you ends up in a fight with Rick Patterson? I didn't want to fight anyone, sir, David said honestly. He pushed me twice. I tried to de-escalate. When he came at me the third time, I defended myself. The warden leaned back in his chair. The footage backs up your story. You never threw a punch, never initiated contact. What I can't figure out is how you put Rick on his back like that. Guy's been in plenty of fights. He doesn't go down easy. David stayed quiet. He didn't want to lie, but he also didn't want to give away more information than necessary. You got military training? The warden asked. There it was. The question David had been avoiding since he arrived. He could lie, but lying to the warden seemed like a bad idea. Yes, sir. 8 years. The warden nodded slowly, like something had just clicked into place. That explains it. Well, here's how this is going to work. The footage shows clear self-defense. You're going back to general population. Patterson is staying in segregation for another week. After that, he goes back too. What happens next is up to you two. I don't want any more problems, David said. I just want to do my time. Then I'd suggest you have a conversation with Patterson when he gets out. Because right now you embarrassed him in front of the whole cell block. Guys like him don't forget that. They either let it go or they come back for round 2. David understood. Can I request to talk to him before he's released? The warden raised an eyebrow. That's unusual, but I'll allow it. Supervised, obviously. 2 days later, David was escorted to a small meeting room. Rick was already there, sitting at a metal table handcuffed to a bolt in the center. A guard stood by the door watching. Rick looked up when David walked in, and his expression was hard to read. Anger, definitely, but also confusion. Maybe even a little respect. David sat down across from him. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, David broke the silence. Look, I didn't come here to gloat or make things worse. I came here to say I'm sorry. Rick's eyebrows shot up. You're sorry? For what? For embarrassing you in front of everyone. That wasn't my goal. I was just trying to protect myself. Rick stared at him like he was speaking a foreign language. Who are you, man? Seriously. You come in here looking like some scared accountant and then you drop me like I'm nothing. What's your deal? David took a breath. Before I was an accountant, I was in the military. I was a combat instructor. I know how to fight, but that's not why I'm telling you this. I'm telling you because I don't want to fight. Not with you, not with anyone. I just want to survive my sentence and get back to my daughter. Rick leaned back in his chair as much as the handcuffs allowed. You could have told people. Could have made yourself a big deal in here. Why didn't you? Because being a big deal in prison gets you nothing but trouble. I'm not trying to take over anybody's territory. I'm not trying to challenge Bull or you or anyone else. I'm literally just trying to keep my head down and go home. Rick was quiet for a minute, processing this. You know, if word gets out about your background, people are going to test you. Everyone with something to prove will want a piece of you. That's why I'm hoping word doesn't get out, David said, looking Rick in the eyes. And that starts with you and me right here. We can keep this going, keep the beef alive, and make both our lives miserable for the next few years. Or we can squash it right now. Your call. Rick studied him for a long time. David could see the wheels turning in his head. In prison, reputation was everything. Rick had lost face when David put him on the floor. The easy path would be to keep the conflict going, to prove he wasn't scared, to get revenge. But Rick was smarter than David had given him credit for. You really don't want any problems, do you? I really don't. And if I come at you again? David kept his voice steady. Then I'll defend myself again. But I'd really rather not. Rick nodded slowly. You know what? I believe you. And honestly, man, I'm tired. I've been fighting my whole life. Fighting in juvie, fighting in county, fighting here. Maybe it's time to try something different. He held out his cuffed hand as far as the chain would allow. We're good. No more problems from me. David shook his hand, feeling the tension drain from his shoulders. Thank you. But you should know, Rick added. Bull's going to want to talk to you when you get back. What you did, how you handled it, that got his attention. He doesn't like surprises. What should I expect? Rick shrugged. Bull's not like me. He doesn't fight for fun. He fights when he has to. What he cares about is keeping things stable in the block. You just proved you're not some pushover, but you also proved you're not trying to start trouble. That actually makes his job easier. Just be straight with him like you were with me and you'll probably be fine. When David got back to cell block D, the atmosphere was different. Guys looked at him as he walked past, but it wasn't the predatory staring from before. It was more like curiosity. The new guy wasn't what he seemed, and everyone wanted to know what would happen next. Pete was waiting in their cell, a rare smile on his face. You crazy son of a gun. I've been here 4 years and I've never seen anyone handle Rick like that. I got lucky, David said, setting his bedroll on his bunk. That wasn't luck, and we both know it. Word's already spreading about your background. Some guys are impressed. Some guys are nervous. And Bull wants to see you tomorrow during yard time. David had expected this. Any advice? Pete laughed. Yeah, don't lie to him. Bull's been reading people in here for 12 years. He'll know if you're being straight or feeding him garbage. That night, David lay in his bunk and thought about his daughter. She was 9 years old, living with his ex-wife 2 states away. She didn't understand why Daddy had to go away. Didn't understand what fraud meant or why people went to prison for moving numbers around on computers. He'd made mistakes, big ones, and now he was paying for them. But he'd made a promise to himself and to her. He would survive this place. He would keep his head down. And he would come home to her. Tomorrow he'd face Bull. Whatever happened, happened. But at least the first real test was behind him, and somehow, against all odds, he'd passed. The next morning, David walked into the yard with his stomach in knots. He'd faced combat situations overseas that felt less stressful than this. At least in combat, the rules were clear. Here, everything was unpredictable. Bull Rodriguez was in his usual spot, sitting at a picnic table near the basketball court. He wasn't alone. 3 of his crew sat with him, playing cards and talking quietly. When Bull saw David approach, he said something to the others. They gathered up the cards and walked away without a word. Bull gestured to the bench across from him. Sit, David sat down. Up close, Bull was even more intimidating than from a distance. His arms were thick as tree trunks, and his eyes had the kind of hardness that came from seeing too much violence. You know why you're here? Bull asked. I can guess. Bull leaned forward, resting his massive forearms on the table. See, I run a tight ship in cell block D. I keep things peaceful. Guys do their time without drama. Then you show up, and in 2 weeks, you're putting my lieutenant on his back in front of 100 people. That's not peaceful. I didn't want that to happen, David said carefully. Rick came at me. I defended myself. That's all it was. I saw the footage, Bull said. Warden showed it to me. You're right. You defended yourself. But here's what concerns me. You walked in here playing the role of some scared accountant, but you move like a trained fighter. That's called deception. And I don't like deception. David met his eyes. It wasn't deception. I am an accountant. But before that, I was military. I didn't advertise it because I didn't want the attention. I just wanted to do my time quietly. And how's that working out for you? Bull asked with the ghost of a smile. Not great, David admitted. Bull nodded. Here's my problem. Word's getting around about what you did. Some of the younger guys are impressed. They're asking questions, wanting to know more about you. That creates instability. In here, instability gets people hurt. David stayed quiet, waiting to see where this was going. So I got a choice, Bull continued. I can see you as a threat and handle you accordingly. Or I can see you as an opportunity. Which one do you think you are? I'm not a threat to you or your operation, David said. I have no interest in challenging your authority. 0. But I don't know what you mean by opportunity. Bull looked out across the yard, watching the other inmates. These young guys in here, most of them don't know how to control themselves. They're angry all the time, fighting over nothing, disrespecting the guards and making things harder for everyone. They don't understand discipline. He turned back to David. But you do. Military background, you said? That means you understand chain of command. You understand following orders. You understand discipline. David nodded slowly, starting to see where this might be going. What if, Bull said, instead of hiding what you know, you shared it, taught some of these knuckleheads how to control themselves, how to think before they act. It would make my life easier. and it might help them survive in here. You want me to train them? David asked, surprised. Not fighting. I'm not trying to create a gang of trained fighters. But discipline? Self-control? How to de-escalate situations? Yeah, that's what I'm talking about. David thought about it. This wasn't what he'd expected at all. What does that look like exactly? Bull shrugged his huge shoulders. That's up to you. Maybe you talk to small groups during yard time. Share what you know. Keep it informal. The guards won't care as long as it doesn't look like gang activity. And if it helps reduce the number of fights in here, they might even support it. And what do you get out of this? David asked. In prison, nobody did anything for free. Stability, Bull said simply. Fewer fights means less heat from the administration, less scrutiny, better conditions for everyone. Plus, if you're busy teaching, you're not causing problems. And guys will respect you for helping them instead of wondering if you're trying to take over. It was actually a smart play, David realized. Bull was turning a potential threat into an asset while also improving conditions in the block. I'll need Rick's blessing on this. I don't want him thinking I'm trying to undermine him. Rick and I already talked. He's on board. In fact, he thinks it might help some of the guys he vouches for. Keep them out of trouble. David took a deep breath. This was a way forward he hadn't considered. Okay, I'll do it. But I have conditions, Bull's eyebrow raised. You're in prison negotiating conditions with me? Just 2 conditions, David said, keeping his voice respectful but firm. First, this is voluntary. Anyone who wants to learn, great, but I'm not forcing anyone. Second, I teach what I think is useful, not what you or anyone else tells me to teach. I won't compromise on that. Bull studied him for a long moment. Then he extended his hand. Deal, but understand this. You're doing this with my blessing. If you step out of line, if you use this to build your own crew or cause problems, that blessing disappears. We clear? David shook his hand. Bull's grip was like a vice. Crystal clear. Good, start tomorrow. Keep it small at first. See who's interested. And Richardson? Bull's expression got serious. Don't make me regret this. That night, Pete couldn't believe what David told him. You're going to teach classes in prison? Man, I've seen everything now. It's not classes, David corrected. Just informal conversations. Sharing what I know. Still, that's wild. You think anyone will actually show up? David shrugged. I guess we'll find out. The next day during yard time, David picked a spot near the fence and waited. He wasn't sure anyone would come, but within 5 minutes, 3 young guys wandered over. They looked nervous, like they weren't sure if this was a good idea. You the guy who dropped Rick? One of them asked. He couldn't have been more than 22. Yeah, David said. Rick said you might teach us some stuff, like how to handle situations without losing our cool. David gestured for them to sit down. What's your name? Tony. Okay, Tony, first thing you need to understand is that fighting should always be your last option, not your first. In here, every fight you get into makes your life harder. It extends your sentence if you get caught. It creates enemies. It makes the guards watch you closer. Is that what you want? Tony shook his head. Nah, man. I just don't want people thinking I'm soft. Being in control of yourself isn't soft, David said. It's the opposite. It takes more strength to walk away from a fight than to throw a punch. Any idiot can fight. It takes a strong person to stay calm. The other 2 guys nodded. One of them spoke up. But what if someone disrespects you? You just supposed to take it? Depends on the situation, David said. Sometimes the best response is no response. Someone calls you a name? So what? Words are just air. They can't hurt you unless you let them. But if someone puts their hands on you, that's different. Then you defend yourself, but you do it smart. You control the situation instead of letting your emotions control you. They talked for about 20 minutes that first day. David shared basic concepts about breathing techniques to stay calm, about reading body language, about the difference between reacting and responding. Nothing fancy, just practical wisdom. By the end of the week, the small group of 3 had grown to 8. Word was spreading. The quiet accountant who dropped Rick was teaching guys how to survive without constantly fighting. Even some of the older inmates started paying attention. Rick showed up on day 6. He didn't say anything, just sat down at the back of the group and listened. When the session ended, he pulled David aside. This is good stuff, Rick said. I wish someone had taught me this when I was their age. Maybe I wouldn't have spent half my life locked up. It's never too late to learn, David offered. Rick smiled sadly. For some of us it is. but maybe not for them. David watched the young inmates walking away, talking among themselves about what they'd learned. For the first time since arriving at Oakwood Correctional, he felt like he might actually be doing something worthwhile. He was still in prison, still separated from his daughter, still paying for his mistakes. But maybe, just maybe, he could help make sure some of these guys didn't end up making the same mistakes he had. And in a place as dark as this, that small light of purpose meant everything. 15 months. That's how long David had been inside when the parole board called his name. He'd served half his sentence with perfect behavior, participated in every program available, and stayed completely out of trouble after that first incident with Rick. His lawyer said he had a good shot at early release. The night before his hearing, David couldn't sleep. He lay in his bunk thinking about everything that had happened since that first day on the bus. How scared he'd been. How certain he was that he'd just have to survive and get through it. He never imagined he'd end up making a difference. The teaching sessions had grown beyond anything he'd expected. What started as 3 guys sitting in the yard had become a regular gathering of 20 or 30 inmates. David taught them breathing exercises for managing anger. He taught them how to read situations before they escalated. He taught them the difference between respect and fear, between strength and aggression. But more than techniques, he taught them something simpler. He taught them that they had a choice in how they responded to the world. That being in prison didn't mean giving up on being a decent person. That discipline wasn't about following rules blindly. It was about controlling yourself so you could make better decisions. The guards had noticed. A counselor named Dr. Helen Matthews had approached him 3 months into his teaching. She was a woman in her 40s who'd worked in corrections for 15 years and had seen every kind of inmate there was. "What you're doing is working," she'd told him during a private meeting in her office. "Fights in cell block D are down 40% since you started these sessions." The warden's impressed. "I'm just sharing what I know," David had said. "It's more than that. These men respect you because you're not pretending to be perfect. You're in here just like them, paying for your mistakes just like them, but you're showing them there's a better way. That matters." Dr. Matthews had helped him formalize things. She got approval for David to write down his lessons, to create something that could outlast his time at Oakwood. So David spent his evenings after lockdown writing. He filled notebook after notebook with everything he'd learned about discipline, self-control, and survival. Not just in prison, but in life. The parole hearing was brief. 3 board members sat behind a long table asking questions. They reviewed his record, asked about the incident with Rick, asked about his teaching program. David answered honestly, didn't make excuses, and explained what he'd learned from his time inside. "Mr. Richardson," the chairwoman said at the end, "in my 12 years on this board, I've rarely seen an inmate make the kind of positive impact you've had. Your counselor speaks highly of you." The warden submitted a letter of recommendation. "Even some of the inmates you've worked with wrote letters on your behalf." "That's unusual." David felt his throat tighten. "I made a serious mistake that landed me here. I hurt people with what I did, even if I didn't mean to. But I didn't want to waste this time. If I was going to be here, I wanted to do something good with it." 2 weeks later, the decision came through. Early release approved. David would be going home. The day he was scheduled to leave, something unprecedented happened. During yard time, guys started gathering near the fence where David usually taught. Not just the regular group, everyone. Pete was there. Tony and the other young guys were there. Even some of the hardened lifers who'd never shown interest before had come out. And then Bull walked over with Rick right beside him. The yard went quiet. Bull rarely addressed groups like this. When he spoke, people listened. "Richardson's leaving today," Bull said, his deep voice carrying across the yard. "Some of you know him. Some of you learned from him. Some of you probably think he's just some guy who got lucky. But I'm here to tell you that what he did here mattered." Bull looked around at all the faces watching. "This place tries to break you. It tries to make you hard and mean and angry. Richardson showed up and proved you can be strong without being violent. You can have respect without running a crew. You can survive without losing yourself. That's not nothing." Rick stepped forward. "When I first tested this guy, I thought he was just another scared fish. But he taught me something important. He taught me that the strongest move isn't always throwing a punch. Sometimes it's having the guts to make peace instead. I'm not going to lie and say I'm a changed man, but I'm trying to be better because of what he showed me." David felt emotion welling up in his chest. He'd come here expecting to just survive, to count down the days until he could see his daughter again. He never expected this. Tony, the young kid who'd been in his first group, spoke up next. "Before I met you, I was getting into fights every other week. I thought that's just how you had to be in here. You showed me different. I've got 2 more years left on my sentence, but when I get out, I'm going to remember what you taught us. I'm going to do better." One by one, other guys spoke up, sharing how David's lessons had helped them avoid fights, manage their anger, think before reacting. Some of them had tears in their eyes. These were hard men, guys who'd seen violence and survived worse than most people could imagine. But in this moment, they were just humans being honest about how someone had helped them. When it was time for David to leave, Bull walked with him to the gate. "You did good, Richardson, real good. Don't come back here," David smiled. "That's the plan. And that notebook you wrote? Dr. Matthews is getting it approved to distribute to other facilities. You're going to help guys you'll never even meet." They shook hands one last time. Bull's grip was still like iron, but there was genuine warmth in it now. "Take care of yourself, Bull," David said. "You too, man. Go home to your daughter. Be the father she deserves." Walking through the prison gates as a free man felt surreal. David stood in the parking lot for a moment, breathing fresh air that didn't smell like concrete and industrial cleaner. His ex-wife was waiting in her car to drive him to the halfway house where he'd complete his parole. But more importantly, sitting in the back seat with a homemade "Welcome Home Daddy" sign was his daughter. She was 11 now, 2 years older than when he'd left. She looked so much bigger, so much more grown up. She jumped out of the car and ran to him. David dropped to his knees and hugged her tight, feeling tears stream down his face. This was what mattered. This was why he'd survived, why he'd stayed strong, why he'd kept his promise. "I missed you so much," she said into his shoulder. "I missed you too, baby. So much." 3 years later, David was working as a consultant for a prison reform organization. He traveled to facilities across the state, teaching his program to inmates and training staff on conflict de-escalation. His notebook had been professionally published as a guide and was being used in 42 prisons nationwide. He got letters regularly from inmates he'd never met, telling him how his words had helped them. Some were from Oakwood. Tony had written to say he'd been released and was working at a youth center, teaching kids the same lessons David had taught him. Rick had written too, surprisingly. He had 2 more years left but was leading his own group sessions now, passing on what he'd learned. Even Bull had written once a short note that just said, "Still keeping things stable. Your legacy lives on here, respect." David kept all the letters in a box in his home office. On hard days, when he struggled with the shame of his past or worried about his future, he'd read through them. They reminded him that people could change, that mistakes didn't have to define you, that even in the darkest places you could find light if you were willing to share it. His daughter was 14 now, doing well in school, and their relationship had healed. She knew what he'd done, knew why he'd gone to prison, but she also knew he'd spent that time trying to help others. She told him once that she was proud of him for that, and those words meant more to him than anything else in the world. The prisoners had picked the wrong person to test that day in the cafeteria. Not because David was dangerous, but because he was someone who chose to lift people up instead of putting them down. Someone who understood that real strength wasn't about domination. It was about discipline. Not about fear, but about respect. And in teaching others that lesson, David had learned the most important lesson of all, that redemption wasn't about erasing your past. It was about using your past to build a better future, not just for yourself, but for everyone whose life you touch along the way. That was the real victory. Not the 4 seconds in the cafeteria when he defended himself, but the 15 months that followed, when he proved that even behind bars, surrounded by concrete and razor wire, the human spirit could still choose kindness over cruelty, hope over despair, and growth over stagnation. The prisoners had picked the wrong person to test. And because they did, dozens of lives were changed for the better, including David's own.